British ships traveled between three regions in what historians call the triangular trade. Manufactured goods left Britain for Africa. Enslaved Africans were then transported across the Atlantic, and plantation goods like sugar, tobacco, and cotton returned to Europe. The most horrifying part of the system was the Middle Passage. This was the journey enslaved Africans were forced to endure across the Atlantic Ocean. Conditions on slave ships were terrifying. Hundreds of people were chained below the decks. There was little air, little food, and almost no space to move. Many became sick. Others died from disease or exhaustion. Historians estimate that millions of Africans were transported through the system, and Britain was responsible for a large portion of those voyages. The trade created enormous wealth for British merchants. Entire cities grew rich from it. Shipbuilders, bankers, plantation owners, all benefited from the system. But while profits increased, another movement was quietly growing in Britain, a movement that believed the slave trade was morally wrong. At the center of this movement was a determined politician named William Wilberforce, and his campaign would soon challenge the entire system. The man who fought the slave trade. By the late 1700s, a growing number of people in Great Britain had begun questioning the morality of the slave trade. Religious groups, writers, and activists were speaking out against the suffering endured by enslaved Africans. Among the most determined opponents of the slave trade was a young politician named William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a member of the British Parliament. Unlike many politicians of his time, he believed that the slave trade was not only cruel, but morally wrong. He joined forces with a group of abolitionists known as the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. This group included activists, former slaves, religious leaders, and writers who were determined to expose the horrors of the trade. One of the most powerful voices in the movement was Olaudah Equiano. Equiano had once been enslaved himself. After gaining his freedom, he wrote a detailed account of his life in slavery. His book described the terrifying conditions aboard slave ships and the suffering endured during the Middle Passage. The book shocked many readers in Britain. For the first time, ordinary people were hearing first-hand descriptions of the brutality of the slave trade. Public opinion slowly began to change. Petitions demanding the abolition of the slave trade were sent to Parliament. Church groups organized campaigns, and thousands of citizens began demanding that the government act. But the slave trade was extremely profitable. Many powerful merchants and politicians opposed abolition. They argued that ending the trade would damage the British economy. When Wilberforce introduced his first bill to abolish the slave trade in Parliament, it faced strong resistance, and the fight to end the trade would take many years. The slave ship that shocked the world. In 1781, a horrifying event occurred aboard a British slave ship called the Zong. The ship was traveling across the Atlantic carrying hundreds of enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade. Like many slave ships of that time, the Zong was overcrowded. More enslaved people had been loaded onto the ship than it could safely carry. Disease quickly spread among the captives. Food and water supplies began running low. As the situation worsened, the crew made a decision that shocked even many supporters of the slave trade. Over several days, the ship's captain ordered enslaved Africans to be thrown overboard into the ocean. More than 130 people were killed in this way. The reason behind this horrific act was not survival. It was money. Under British law at the time, slave ship owners could claim insurance for enslaved people who were lost at sea. The crew believed they could collect insurance payments for the people they had murdered. When news of the massacre reached Britain, it caused outrage among abolitionists. The event became known as the Zong Massacre. Abolitionists used the story to expose the true brutality of the slave trade. They argued that the system treated human beings as cargo rather than people. For many citizens in Britain, this story changed their understanding of the trade. It revealed just how cruel and inhuman the system had become. The movement to end the slave trade grew stronger, but despite public outrage, the slave trade still continued. And it would take more than 20 years of political battles before Parliament finally took action. The long fight in Parliament. After the shock of the Zong Massacre, pressure began building inside Great Britain to end the slave trade. Public awareness had grown. Petitions flooded into Parliament. Churches, writers, and activists continued speaking out. At the center of this fight remained William Wilberforce. Year after year, he stood before Parliament to introduce bills calling for the abolition of the slave trade. Each time, he presented evidence of the horrors of the Middle Passage. Each time, he argued that Britain could no longer support such a brutal system. But each time, he was defeated. The opposition was powerful. Wealthy merchants, plantation owners, and politicians who profited from slavery fought against abolition. They argued that ending the trade would damage the British economy. Some claimed that slavery was necessary for maintaining the empire. Others simply refused to give up the enormous profits the trade generated. Votes were taken. Debates lasted for hours. And still, the slave trade continued. For nearly 20 years, Wilberforce kept returning to Parliament, introducing bill after bill, facing rejection after rejection. Many supporters of abolition began to lose hope, but Wilberforce refused to stop. He believed that the truth would eventually overcome profit and power, and slowly, something began to change. Public opinion was shifting. More people in Britain were beginning to see the slave trade not as a business, but as a moral crime. And this change would soon lead to a moment that would alter history. The turning point. By the early 1900s, the debate over the slave trade had reached a critical point in Great Britain. For years, abolitionists had struggled to convince Parliament to end the trade. But now the pressure was growing stronger. Thousands of citizens across Britain had signed petitions demanding change. Public meetings were held in cities and towns. Newspapers began printing stories exposing the cruelty of the transatlantic slave trade. Even people who had once supported the trade were beginning to question it. One powerful tool used by abolitionists was a famous diagram showing how enslaved Africans were packed inside slave ships. This image revealed the horrifying conditions of the Brooks slave ship diagram. Hundreds of human bodies were shown lying side by side in narrow spaces below the ship's deck. The diagram spread across Britain. People saw, perhaps for the first time, the true reality of the slave trade. At the same time, Britain was facing major political changes. The long wars with France had shifted the priorities of the government. Some leaders began to believe that ending the slave trade could strengthen Britain's moral position in the world. Inside Parliament, William Wilberforce continued pushing for abolition. After nearly 2 decades of struggle, support for his cause had finally grown. More members of Parliament were now willing to vote against the trade. The moment that abolitionists had waited for was finally approaching. The fate of the slave trade would soon be decided by a single vote in Parliament. The vote that ended the trade. By 1807, the long campaign against the slave trade had finally reached its most important moment. Inside the Parliament of Great Britain, lawmakers gathered to debate a bill that could change history. For nearly 20 years, William Wilberforce had introduced similar bills. Each time he had failed. But now the atmosphere inside Parliament had shifted. Public opinion had changed. The abolitionist movement had grown stronger, and more members of Parliament were ready to support the cause. The bill was called the Slave Trade Act, 1807. If passed, it would make it illegal for British ships to transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The debate lasted for hours. Supporters of the slave trade warned that Britain's economy could suffer. They argued that the empire depended on plantation goods such as sugar and cotton. But abolitionists countered with moral arguments. They spoke about the suffering of millions of Africans. They described the horrors of the Middle Passage. And they reminded Parliament that the slave trade had become a stain on Britain's reputation. Finally, the vote was called. Members of Parliament cast their votes one by one. When the counting was finished, the result was overwhelming. The bill had passed. In 1807, the British government officially abolished the slave trade. After centuries of transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, Britain had finally outlawed the trade. For the abolitionists who had fought for decades, it was a moment of triumph. But the story was not over. Because although the slave trade had ended, slavery itself still existed, and the struggle for complete freedom would continue. The war against slave ships. After the Slave Trade Act, 1807, was passed, the government of Great Britain faced a major challenge. Although the law had ended the legal slave trade for British ships, many slave traders continued operating illegally. Slave ships from different nations still sailed along the coast of West Africa, capturing Africans and transporting them across the Atlantic. To stop this illegal trade, Britain took an extraordinary step. The government sent warships to patrol the Atlantic Ocean. This force became known as the West Africa Squadron. The squadron's mission was to hunt down slave ships and free the people held aboard them. British naval officers began intercepting suspicious vessels along the African coastline and across the Atlantic. When slave ships were captured, the enslaved Africans were freed. Many of them were taken to Freetown, a settlement that had been established for freed slaves. The mission was dangerous. Slave traders often tried to escape or fight back. Some ships attempted to outrun the British patrols. Others tried to hide evidence of slavery by throwing captives overboard when naval ships approached. Despite these dangers, the West Africa Squadron managed to rescue thousands of people over the years. Their actions significantly weakened the Atlantic slave trade. But even with these efforts, slavery itself continued in many parts of the world, and the fight for total abolition was not yet finished. The end of slavery in the British Empire. Although the Slave Trade Act, 1807, had ended the transportation of enslaved Africans on British ships, millions of people were still living in slavery across the British Empire. Plantations in the Caribbean continued operating. Enslaved workers were still forced to labor in sugar fields and other plantations. For abolitionists in Great Britain, the struggle was not finished. The next goal was even greater. They wanted slavery itself to end. Activists continued campaigning. Public meetings were organized. Petitions demanding complete abolition were sent to Parliament. Former slaves, writers, and religious leaders joined the growing movement. Among the leaders who continued pushing for change was William Wilberforce, whose decades of work had already helped end the slave trade. Finally, in 1833, the British Parliament passed another historic law. It was called the Slavery Abolition Act, 1833. This act officially ended slavery across most of the British Empire. More than 800,000 enslaved people were legally freed. However, the transition was not immediate. Many former slaves were forced into a temporary system called apprenticeship, where they still had to work for plantation owners for several years before gaining full freedom. Even so, the passage of the law marked a turning point in history. The empire that had once been deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade had now abolished slavery itself. The fight had taken decades. It had required the courage of activists, former slaves, politicians, and ordinary citizens who refused to accept the injustice of slavery. And although the scars of slavery would remain for generations, the abolition movement had changed the course of history. The end of the British slave trade in 1807 was not the end of slavery, but it was the beginning of a larger movement that eventually led to freedom for hundreds of thousands of people. It showed that systems built on cruelty and exploitation could be challenged, and that determined individuals could force powerful nations to change. History is filled with stories that reveal the darkest chapters of the past, stories of injustice, stories of resistance, stories that powerful people once tried to hide. Here on ASHEN Truths, we uncover those forgotten truths. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to ASHEN Truths, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of the story surprised you the most? Let us know below. And until the next story, thank you for watching.